Chapter 28, Valley Forge to Vincennes. All right, so welcome back. Good morning. All right, here we go, Wareham. All right, class. This is Valley Forge. This is where the Patriots are cold. They're dying of cold weather, starvation, smallpox. That's something that's not told about a lot. They actually used a vaccination for smallpox simply by cutting their wrists and spreading the disease on it. They didn't have the fancy ways we do it now and safe ways with injecting it into our bloodstream and testing it first. Luckily, it was a pretty good vaccination. Obviously not as good as the one that's there for COVID-19. That'll be way more technical. But it's interesting that vaccinations have been around for a couple hundred years, and this was kind of the beginning of that, kind of saved the army. So Washington was stayed with his men at Valley Forge. They all built cabins, and until they were all in nice cabins, he stayed with his men. Once all his men were housed, then he went in the nice house. So that's how that went. He was in the nice house with his wife, Martha, and Martha helped out the troops at Valley Forge. This is where Baron von Steuben does his training. It also talks about George Rogers Clark getting some victories in the Ohio River Valley, out west, I guess. We wouldn't consider it west nowadays because it's pretty far east in America, but back then it was west. And the frontiersmen won some battles against the British and Native American forces as well. So we're going to learn about that. And we're not going to read about this, but there's a really cool guy named Nathan Hale from Connecticut, and he was a spy for the Americans. He was a school teacher, and he decided the best way to help the cause was to spy and report to Washington stuff from New York, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. He got caught, and back then a spy was hung. And that's kind of a very bad way to die back then. That pirates got hung, murderers got hung. It wasn't a good way to die. But he was very brave about it. He is famous for saying, "I regret that I only have but one life to lose for my country." So that's pretty brave. And it was so brave, the British who hung him, I believe, were the ones who wrote it down and told the Americans about it. They said, "Hey, we had to kill a spy of yours, but let me tell you, he died like a gentleman." And we just wanted to tell you that. So that must be he must have been pretty heroic that way. All right, so now, and you can read that on your own. It's there. You read it, please. But I'm just going to be reading the chapter. Okay. Things weren't going well for George Washington. He lost 2 battles in Pennsylvania, one at Brandywine, the other at Germantown. Then Sir Billy Howe captured Philadelphia, and that meant that Congress, which was meeting in the State House, now had to flee. The fall of 1777 turned to... All right, so they were in the State House, now called Independence Hall, had to flee. I didn't miss much there. The fall of 1777 turned to winter. Howe was warm and comfortable in Philadelphia, as he had been the winter before in New York. He was partying again. Loyalist families entertained him and his men. 18 miles away, Washington, Lafayette, Baron von Steuben, and the American soldiers were miserable. Washington had brought his army to a place called Valley Forge. It had been named for a nearby iron foundry, although the foundry was now in ruins. The British Army had destroyed it. Valley Forge was a good site from a military point of view. The land was high, near enough to Philadelphia to keep watch on that city, but not so close that the British could cause trouble with surprise raids. There was little there except for farmland and the Schuylkill River. I know that doesn't look like Schuylkill, but it's Schuylkill. It's still there. There were no buildings for the army to use as barracks. And in December, when they arrived, the ground was covered with snow. The men had marched a long distance, and many were in rags. When in a few days the river turned ice hard, a cold wind began blowing. The soldiers pitched tents and built huts of sticks, logs, and mud plaster. Washington, who was precise and cared about appearances, insisted they all be the same size. Picture 2,000 dirt-floored, dirty wood huts lined up in streets like a village, and you have an idea of Valley Forge. If you look at the ground, you may see blood. Some of the soldiers had no shoes, and their toes froze and left bloody tracks. Now add hunger to the scene, and you begin to get an idea of that terrible winter. But that was not the worst of it. Disease swept the camp. About 2,000 men died. That is the way it was at Valley Forge. There wasn't enough clothing. There wasn't enough to eat. It was fiercely cold. The officers feared a mutiny. And there were desertions, but not many. Most of those who slipped over to the British in Philadelphia were newcomers to the colonies. There were no battles fought at Valley Forge, none at all. But something astounding happened there. A spirit evolved. It was amazing. The men who made it through that winter were better for it. They became a team, strong, confident, and proud of themselves, their country, and their leaders. George Washington had a lot to do with that. At first, Washington lived in a tent among his men and put up with hardships as they did. Later, he made his headquarters in a nearby 4-room stone house. But the soldiers remained awed by his example. Awed, meaning they were in awe, like they worshipped him by his example. A young Frenchman who was there wrote of General Washington, "I could not keep my eyes from that imposing countenance. Its predominant expression was calm dignity, through which you could trace the strong feelings of the patriot and the son, the father, as well as the commander of his soldiers." Martha Washington could often be seen with a basket in her arms, bringing food and socks and cheer to those who needed it. Von Steuben made a difference that cold winter, too. He began training 100 men at a time, and soon had the whole army drilled. The Americans were astonished. British officers did not conduct drills. They left that to sergeants. This man did the drilling himself. He seemed to thrive on hard work, and nothing upset him. He was always good-humored, even when he was shouting and swearing. Oh, my God. Before long, the Americans could march and maneuver, load and fire, use bayonets and respond to complicated orders. But that wasn't enough for von Steuben. He expected them to be neat and shaved. Even rags, he told them, could be clean. He made all the officers set their watches by the same clock. He was determined that this army was going to be precise and proud of itself. Soon it was just that. Washington appointed Nathanael Greene as quartermaster general. The quartermaster was in charge of supplies. Greene protested that he didn't want the job, but General Washington knew what he was doing. Greene brought enormous energy and determination to everything he did. He tramped around the countryside, found big caches of food and supplies, and hauled them to Valley Forge. By spring, there was plenty of food and clothing, too. In June, the British left Philadelphia and headed for New York. They'd had a pleasant winter, but they hadn't accomplished a thing. The men who had gotten through the winter at Valley Forge were now a strong fighting force. They knew they could endure almost anything. They were ready to follow George Washington wherever he led. While all that was going on at Valley Forge, the Indians, who were being paid by the British for American scalps, were creating havoc on the frontier. The Americans paid for British scalps. Okay, so both sides were, And I know they're saying Indians, those are Native Americans. But no matter which side they chose, the Native Americans would be losers. Their land was being taken from them. The European way of life and the Native American way of life seemed incompatible. And of course, when we say they were losers, we don't mean that in a sense of, they're making, hey, you're a loser. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking is about no matter what, they're being treated badly. That's really what we're talking about here. That both British and Americans never honored their treaties, and Native Americans would suffer. That's what we're talking about. All right. Most of the settlers didn't understand what was happening. When they heard of Indian raids and scalpings, they were horrified. They believed what they had been told, that Indians were savages. They knew the English were signing treaties that gave Native Americans protection and rights. That was another reason they wanted the British out. So most colonists thought of Indian fighters as great heroes. Those Indian fighters, men like George Rogers Clark, believed they were doing the right thing. Mostly they just wanted to push the Native Americans west, to free new lands for the settlers. Clark was a frontiersman and a patriot, as well as an Indian fighter. Born in Virginia near Jefferson's home, Clark knew Indians well and could talk to them in a way they understood. He had learned to use their form of oratory. They called him Michimalsa, which means big knife. Clark was smart. He was also brave and daring. He had hardly any schooling, but he read all the books he could find. Some people called him the Washington of the West. Like George Washington, he was tall, very strong, and a surveyor. But that was where the resemblance ended. He had none of the dignity of the Virginian planter. Clark's personality swung from fierce temper to calm persuasion, but rarely rested anywhere. He was 25 years old in 1778 when he persuaded Virginia's governor, Patrick Henry, to let him gather a force to take the Ohio Valley from the British and their Indian allies. Then he proceeded to win some astounding battles. Here's some of what he did. With just 175 men and a few barges, Clark captured 3 strategically located British forts: Cahokia, Kaskaskia, and Vincennes. Then he talked the French inhabitants of the region into coming over to the American cause. It was the Battle of Vincennes that made him famous. When Clark fought at Fort Vincennes, he had hardly 150 men, most of whom were sick with chills and fever. A desperate situation, he said, needs a desperate resolution. Clark sent a note to the British commander demanding the surrender of the fort. The British leader refused. Clark attacked. He decided to confuse his enemy. He kept his men yelling like maniacs and demons as they fired through gun holes into the fenced fort. To those inside, it seemed as if a huge army was attacking. The fort depended on cannons for protection. But cannons are useless against moving targets. Clark never stopped moving. The British surrendered. Later, England moved back into much of that region, but for a while it seemed as if a young backwoodsman had captured the Ohio territory. The Americans were frustrating the British. Men like George Rogers Clark just wouldn't fight the way they were expected to fight. And they never seemed to give up. All right? Yeah, so when he fought that battle, the British were amazed when they surrendered. Like, we surrendered to this many people. Like, he tricked them, and they thought there were a lot of them, and they weren't. All right, so now we're moving on in the Revolution, and we'll start studying Yorktown and the victory of the American Revolution tomorrow. The war's almost over. Oh, don't you want to keep going? Maybe we'll do some extra chapters. What do you say?